1902, and a premier scientific institution has just been founded for studying farming in tropical climates, and it would soon be staffed by some of the world's most renowned scientists. This was the Amani Research Institute, and has just been founded not in Europe or North America, but in the Usambara mountain ranges in what was then German East Africa. The research facility would soon expand beyond its initial farming mission into the fields of medicine and disease research, and its findings would spread far beyond its colonial homeland. Scientists who worked there were household names in 1900. Even in the words of the German Empire's rival, the British Empire, Amani would become a tropical scientific institute superior to anything in the British colonies. And Amani's output would not be limited to dissertations or research papers, for soon it would be producing vital goods unavailable anywhere else in the colony when it was invaded by the British during the First World War. But why was this Amani founded in the first place, so far from similar institutes normally located in North America and Europe, far from any of the researchers' homeland? Well, in the years before instant internet communications, and live feeds set up from cameras in locations all around the world, to study a particular environment, the scientists would have to go there and be physically present. Soil samples and weather readings shipped overseas could only go so far, and other studies were simply impossible. Ecological observations of live plants and animals would have to be done in the environment where they live. Agricultural studies were only truly effective in the climate and the soil where its findings would be applied, and medical research had to take place in an area where the disease being studied were actually present. At the turn of the century, much of the world's scientific community was based in North America and Europe, and so that is where much ecological study had been taking place. Studies naturally gravitated towards the research of temperate flora and fauna, as that was what was readily available for study. Even today, according to a study done by Cornell University, tropical regions of the world make up 40% of the world's landmass, but only about 10% of published studies are based at tropical field sites. And in the 19th century, with the limitation of transportation and communication, it was simply unrealistic to perform research in tropical areas that did not have their own facilities available. However, as European empires of the time rose to control large swathes of the tropical globe in Africa and Asia, a unique opportunity for study arose. This is where colonial research stations like Amani began to fit into the picture. Beginning in 1896, an agricultural test station was founded in Usambara, 50 miles inland from the major port of Tanga in what is today's Tanzania. The mission of the small station was to perform agricultural and livestock experiments, along the model of similar stations already present in British and Dutch colonies. However, ambition soon outgrew the small limitations of the facility. Thus, the Institute at Amani, named for the Swahili word for peace, was born. From its beginning in 1902, a primary focus of the new enlarged institute was the production of chinchoa, a tree whose bark could be refined to produce quinine. Quinine is a critical medicine in the treatment of malaria, a devastating mosquito-borne disease that the world is living with even now. According to the World Health Organization, over 500,000 people died of the disease in 2019, and its effects have been omnipresent throughout history. According to the Dutch Research Institute, far from being only a tropical disease, it took until 1948 for the swampy Netherlands to be finally declared free of malaria. And in 1802, in that same country, a British expedition aimed at driving out Napoleon was destroyed without a fight from malaria, which wiped out 30,000 men. 60 years later, almost as many Americans died during the Civil War from malaria as on the battlefield. And in World War I, a key factor in the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army in Greece was a malaria epidemic. It goes without saying that to have a supply of the only medicine that could combat such a debilitating disease would be critical for any nation, in peace as much as during war. The only problem was that, in 1902, the Dutch had a stranglehold on the worldwide quinine market. Originally from South America, the chinchoa tree was extensively cultivated in the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, in order to produce high-grade quinine. Although previous efforts by the British to smuggle seeds out of the Indies for their own production in India yielded marginal results, the majority production was still held by the Dutch. Franz Stumann, a naturalist and zoologist at Amani, led the effort to bring chinchoa to German East Africa to cultivate its own supply of the crucial drug. With the help of fellow scientists in the Dutch Research Institute at Uitzorg, chinchoa was smuggled from Java and set up in plantations around Amani. This would be the very first seedlings of what would become the largest arboretum of tropical plants in the world around Amani. After some initial mishaps, the East African climate proved excellent for chinchoa cultivation, and the production of quinine for research began in earnest. In parallel with the efforts to study its treatment, scientists at Amani began work to study malaria itself. One of Amani's most famous visitors, Robert Koch, the 1891 director of the Institute of Infectious Disease, was able to conclusively link the spread of malaria to seasonal patterns. The disease was determined to be far more common during East Africa's rainy season, owing to the great increase in malaria-bearing mosquitoes. In addition, Koch discovered that malaria was absent at elevations over 4,300 feet, or 1,300 meters. Observations that were helped by the Institute's location high in the Usambara Mountains. Koch would go on to research other diseases that were endemic to Africa, including East Coast fever that were affecting the region's cattle, before finally returning home to publish his findings. As the Amani Institute would begin to develop a reputation for medical innovation, Paul Ehrlich would begin his studies on syphilis at the facility. Syphilis, a potentially deadly sexually transmitted disease, had no effective treatment in the period. In 1911 alone, 1 in 10 Londoners were living with syphilis, and in 1917, it's estimated that 6% of American servicemen had contracted the disease. By contrast, in 2014, the current incidence of syphilis in America is 6.3 per 100,000 people. The common attempt at treatment of the disease at the time was to prescribe doses of mercury, which was both poisonous and ineffective. Ehrlich, who studied at Amani in 1906, hypothesized that instead of using poison that affected the entire body in the effort to kill just one harmful bacteria, there should be a way to target the disease, just in the same way a bullet could be aimed at a target. This would be the foundation of his magic bullet theory. This was the first theory to hypothesize targeted treatment, or a treatment that aims to attack only the bacteria or virus that is causing a disease. It was building on this theory that he developed at Amani that his lab created the first effective treatment for syphilis, salivarisin, which would target only the bacteria that caused the disease, and become the go-to treatment before the discovery of penicillin some decades later. The star of the Amani Research Institute continued to rise, but the time of unrestrained research into farming and medicine soon came to an end at Amani when war broke out in 1914. Although the colony tried to stay out of the conflict, German East Africa was drawn in when the British attempted to seize the colony. This was done through the institution of a naval blockade on a region that was 3 times the size of Germany and a population of 7.7 million, cutting it off from the rest of the world. Through the remarkable defensive leadership of the colony's General Paul Emile von Lettow-Vorbeck, the colony was saved from initial British incursions, and Amani joined the colony in a spirited defense of what would become a war from all sides. The colony was completely surrounded, with the British hemming in the sea, and on land being surrounded by British, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies, which were hostile to Germany. What German East Africa could not produce for itself, it had to do without, and there were some things that it simply could not do without. It did not matter how brilliantly led the colony's small army was, if the population were to starve. As luck would have it for the colony, 1914 had been planned as a year as a major colonial exhibition, and in preparation for that event, 2 large steamers full of tinned milk, butter, vegetables, and fruit had recently been unloaded in the capital of Dar es Salaam. However, such stocks could not feed the European population for long, and goods besides food would have to be produced locally if the colony were to hold out. With its staff of 10 Europeans and 100 locals, the institution at Amani threw itself into the task to try and synthesize and produce crucial goods that could no longer be imported from Europe. According to a report produced after the war, the 1925 report of the East Africa Commission said, Considerable ingenuity was shown in producing in the colony manufactured goods and medical supplies normally imported from Europe. Quinine was made at the Amani Institute and Mwapa. Dyestuffs were made from native barks. In the first 18 months of the war, the Amani Agricultural Research Institute prepared for use from its own products 16 varieties of foodstuff and liquor, 11 varieties of spice, 12 varieties of medicines, 5 varieties of rubber products, 2 of soaps, oil, and candles, 3 of materials used in making boats, and 10 miscellaneous substances. Many of these were prepared in comparatively large quantities. For example, 15,000 bottles of whiskey and alcoholic liquor, 10,000 pounds of chocolate and cocoa, 2,600 parcels of tooth powder, 10,000 pieces of soap, 300 bottles of castor oil, and much more. And Amani's emergency production did not only serve the needs of the colony's defense force, the Schutztruppe, it served the needs of the entire colony. Through the Usambara Railway, goods manufactured in Amani could be shipped to population centers in Tanga and Dar es Salaam. Quinine, the critical malarial drug, was extracted from Amani's arboretum. What had started as limited cultivation of chinchoa trees for research purposes grew to producing half of the colony's quinine needs during the war, the rest being smuggled in through blockade runners in the briefly neutral Mozambique. Through the opening of hostilities in the summer of 1914 to the spring of 1916, the colony held its ground. Basing the defense of German East Africa around Mount Kilimanjaro, the Schutztruppe successfully raided into British East Africa, cutting the critical Nairobi to Mombasa railway on several instances, and keeping the British from incurring unto the north of the colony where Amani was located. Skirmishes with the Belgians from the Congo and Portuguese from Mozambique proved largely successful. It seemed like German East Africa would be able to hold out. But all that changed in March of that year, when, massively reinforced by South African and Indian contingents, the British launched a massive invasion of the colony from British East Africa. 6/7 of the colony was lost in that offensive, supplemented by a crushing Belgian victory at Tabora. Amani itself was lost when a former British colleague of the German scientists working there walked into the institute and demanded its surrender, having been guided there by a native who recognized him from his time there before. It looked like Amani's contribution to the war would be over. Through von Lettow-Vorbeck's brilliant leadership of the settlers and natives who fought under him, the Schutztruppe was never defeated, even invading neighboring Portuguese Mozambique and British Northern Rhodesia for supplies to keep the colony's defense alive. But when Germany surrendered in 1918, German East Africa, too, would be forced to surrender, the only German colony to have been undefeated in the war. The colony was then taken and broken up between the victorious powers, Belgium, Portugal, and British, everyone taking a slice, with the British taking the lion's share under the name Tanganyika, which include Amani. The conquerors were impressed both with Amani's international reputation and the quality of research conducted there and continued operating as a research institute under British post-war government. However, only 6 years later, the British-produced East Africa Commission revealed that the new British caretakers of the institute were no fine stewards. Just 22 years after the Germans had founded it, the report said that this world-famous research institute is, for all practical purposes, lying derelict, its laboratories unoccupied, its costly apparatus dismantled, the living quarters deteriorating, the magnificent and priceless collection of books and scientific records and specimens are unused. The institute was later converted into a Malaria Research Institute that was served the colony through the 1950s. After becoming independent from the British, the new country of Tanzania continues to maintain the institute, renamed the Amani Medical Research Center of the National Institute for Medical Research, still operating today. The research once done in its colonial days, little is left of the once prized chinchoa trees, whose bark was worth its weight in gold, the plantation having been destroyed in the 1960s. But many of its German-built buildings, and what had been the largest arboretum of the world, still stand, with over 3,000 different species still found in Amani in 2007. And so, a small tropical research station, created on the fringe of a now-destroyed empire, for the purpose of studying farming and medicine, whose contribution to that empire's defense proved invaluable in its hour of need, still has a place in today's scientific community. Like many of its still-standing German-raised buildings and planted trees, its century-old research and story of resilience proves valuable today.